We're in a series right now called On Point. As a church, we've been given a job to do. As followers of Jesus Christ, we've been given a job to do. And we've been looking over these last couple weeks, how do we continue to keep ourselves on point? How do we, as we start the new year, as we're looking down another year, by the way, I can't believe what year it is already. You ever start trying to write your dates down and you just kind of like, I don't know what date to put down anymore? I don't know, somewhere between 2019, I lost all. 2020, it kind of just thoroughly did it in for me. And I just am at that point, I don't know, what date is it? But as we face down the barrel of another year, how do we allow ourselves to stay on point? How do we continue to do what we know we are called to do? As followers of Jesus Christ, we have been given a job to do. Now, we began to look at what this job was, and we started to talk about this idea that we have a certain responsibility, and that responsibility that God gave to us is that we stop and help people come into a relationship or come into a closer relationship with Him. And we just talked, and I just want to be straight up front with you. If you walk in the doors this morning, I have an agenda for you. I don't try to hide it. My agenda is that as you leave this morning, that your walk with Jesus Christ will be a little bit closer than it was when you walked in. If you came in this morning and said, Pastor, I came because someone kind of twisted my arm a little bit and they kind of put the guilt trip on me, and so I'm here. I get it. I don't believe that. I understand. My goal is that as you leave here, you at least stop and you would consider and say, hey, you know what? I'll at least think about it. If you are already a follower of Jesus Christ, my goal is that you stop and you go, you know what? I want to know Him a little bit more. Wherever you are at in your faith journey, my goal is that you come to know Him a little bit more. We went on and we went beyond that and saying if we're going to come and we're going to move closer in our relationship with Jesus Christ, one of the things that God calls us to do is that our lives begin to look like Him. He calls us that our lives are transformed from who we were to who He is. And we began to look at that idea of what does a transformed life look like? What does it look like to look a little bit more like Jesus? And he begins to stop and says, if your life is going to look more like mine, you must begin to get your eyes as others focused. Our eyes cannot be so stuck on ourselves that we miss other people. Last week, we began to talk about this idea that if we become others focused as our lives are being transformed like Him, we have got to learn how to put into words what He's done for us. How do you talk about your faith? Has your faith made a difference in your life that when someone talks to you, you can say, hey, this is what my faith is about? And I'm going to be right up front with you this morning. I truly believe that what God has given to us, that the faith that He has given to us is of more value today than at any other time in history. There used to be a time that as we look back, in fact, when I moved into the South, when I started coming to college back here in the South, back in the early 90s, you would go down the street and almost anybody you talked to would literally put their hand up. If you said what church you went to, you didn't have to ask anything else. You just, what church you go to. And somebody would tell you a church, wouldn't they? In fact, you could have stopped, and in the early 90s when I came here, the culture was different. Today, as we begin to talk about church, and there's still a lot of churchgoers, aren't there? But it's not so much, is it? As we start coming to younger and younger generations in the South, we're finding that we are walking away from our faith. And I've got to be honest with you, I believe that our faith holds as much, if not more value today than it did back in the early 90s. Today we need more hope than ever before. Today we need more forgiveness than we ever needed before. Today we need more purpose than we have ever needed. Today we need an idea of what is this life all about that can only be answered in one person. You say, Pastor, you're a pastor, you're supposed to say that. And I can honestly tell you this, even if I was not a pastor, I firmly believe that the hope that we need as a society is found in only one place, and that's Jesus Christ. So when Paul was writing, we began to look last week, and we looked at this passage just briefly, where Paul began to tell us in Colossians chapter 3, or Colossians chapter 4, Paul wrote this, and he says this to the Colossian church. They found themselves at a similar time in history where there was so many problems that were coming on, and the early church was just beginning to face different persecutions. And Paul wrote to the early Colossian church, and he says this, all right, guys, live wisely. Live wisely to those who are not believers, and make the most of every opportunity that you have. Let your conversations be gracious and attractive, that you will have the right response for everyone. Paul stopped and he looked at him and he says, you guys have a hope that you need to have an answer for why you have this hope. Last week we began to look at, hey, how do we begin to talk about this hope that we have? And we gave 4 things last week on how to discuss this hope we have. And we began to say this, well, if you want to discuss this hope, what made me consider following Jesus Christ? What was going on in my life that made me want to consider following Jesus Christ? Number 2, well, if you ever went to Sunday school, you know the answer is always Jesus, right? Number 2, what did Jesus do? What does the cross mean? Why is the cross important? Number 3, what am I learning now? What is Jesus doing in my life now? How am I changing? And number 4, the choice that they have to make. You can't make a decision for other people. Wouldn't it be great if we could stop out there and say, hey, I'm going to make this choice for you? Yet sometimes as we are coming up with answers to the hope that we have, there's one important point that I want to actually take a step back. So we talked about, hey, you need to have an answer for the hope that you have. But I want to stop and just kind of say, as we talk about it, the problem is as we're figuring out an answer to the hope we have, we miss an important part, and that important part is this. Paul says, let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response for everyone. Other translations use that word response, and it says that you may have an answer to give to everyone. The idea of having a response or having an answer implies there must be a... All right, I see Rusty got it. The idea that we have a response or an answer implies that there first must be a question. In other words, Paul is telling them, you have a hope that you have been given. Now, to the questions that you are being given, know how to answer those questions. Paul is looking at us, and Paul was talking to the Colossian church that your faith should have answers to the questions that people have. And yet this concerns me as followers of Jesus Christ. Do you know why? Because sometimes, and we almost, and get a little bit afraid because we talked about last week how to begin to create an answer for the hope we have. Hey, the problem is that sometimes as we begin to look for answers, we begin to look for answers to questions that nobody is even asking. Have you ever found that? You ever started having a conversation with your spouse or your kids, and as you're talking and you're trying to ask a question, they keep answering questions that you're not even asking? Okay, maybe I'm the only one who does that. And my wife will go, "Stop, that's not what I'm asking." But we find ourselves sometimes coming up with answers that people are not concerned with. The other reason that this concerns me is that sometimes as we have people who ask us questions, we begin to give answers based upon a feeling. I have a feeling about this. I have an opinion, as opposed to an answer. Now, let's go back to the church at Colossae. As Paul began, he stops and he says this, and I don't know, he says, live wisely among, I didn't put it in here. I put it up there. Thank you, Dave. Live wisely among those who are not believers, and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive, that you may have the right response for everyone. Paul begins to say, as you're looking for answers, you need to remember three things. One, you should be wise. Number two, your conversation should be gracious. Number three, you should find answers to the problems that we face in life. It seems kind of common sense, doesn't it? Okay, just real briefly, can I just be really clear? Sometimes as followers of Jesus Christ, number one, this is not us. I wish it was. Paul actually has to write to us, and he says, live wisely. Let your conversations be gracious and attractive. 3, find answers. Your life, your faith, the hope you have should give answers to the problems we face in life. Sometimes the meanest people, and you know this because you've been around them as much as I have, we can become the meanest people when we have the hope in us. And Paul is looking at us saying, guys, be wise, be gracious, find answers. How do we do this? How do we stop and remove answers? If our faith is going to make a difference to those around us, how do we stop and allow our lives to be wise, our conversation gracious, and how do we find answers? And I believe we can find these things through Scripture. I mean, it's easy to say, right? I want to start in Philippians chapter 2. Paul begins to give us an idea. How do we help find answers? How do we become wise? How do we allow our conversations to be gracious? How do we help find answers to the problems that we have? Number one, Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, and he's writing to the Philippian church, and he tells them this. Guys, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out for your own interests, but take interest in others too. In order to have questions, or in order to have an answer to the questions that are being asked, one of the things we have to do is to change our attitude towards people who have the questions. You see, sometimes after being a follower of Jesus Christ for a while, we kind of say this, we kind of think this, and I know we would never say it. My problems are the only one that really matters. The issues that I'm dealing with are real issues. The issues you're dealing with are... Now, we would never say it, would we? But each of us, we just by nature deal with this problem that the most important person in the world is me. We become so consumed with the person that we see in the mirror that we literally cannot take seriously the questions that other people have. But Paul reminds us, if you're going to have answers to questions that people have, if you're going to know how to have that hope, and by the way, we have the hope. We have a Savior who died for us, who forgave us, who stops and gives us a future. And he simply says, for whosoever shall come to me, I will not cast out. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. We have been given a Savior that simply says, come to me. We have a hope. But how does that hope stop and answer other people's questions? And sometimes we don't really know. We have an answer, but it's not based upon the questions that are being asked. And Paul says you need to stop and have an attitude that puts value on other people in the same way that God values you. Second, James, Jesus' brother, he stops and he also reminds us, if you're going to have an answer that is going to make a difference in people's lives, he continues with this. And he says this in James chapter 1, verse 19. He says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak. Now, I've got to be honest with you. This one, I hate to put in there. You know why I hate to put this one in? Because by my very nature, I'm a little ADD. I can't help it. I want to do one thing first. I want to talk. My brain gets working faster, or I should say my mouth begins to work faster than my brain can and my ears can. It's easy for me to get upset, and it's easy for me to get angry at. It's easy for me to, and Paul says, whoa, hang on. If you're going to be part of having an answer to a hope that lies within you, number one, you need to change your attitude towards others. Number two, you need to actually stop and hear the question. You see, we want to come up with all sorts of answers to questions that aren't even being asked. Who did Cain marry? Did Cain marry his sister? Did Noah really take 2 of every kind of animal on the ark? And we've got answers for things that really a lot of people just really aren't even asking. And I'm not saying it's bad and it's good and it's interesting to know these things, but does it help answer the questions that people are asking? And by the way, most of the questions that we begin to get asked us are not as easy to answer as did Noah take 2 of every animal on the ark. By the way, society has gotten so much more complicated today, hasn't it? And questions come out that we don't know how to answer. Can God love my child who's just come out of the closet? can God forgive me of what I did in the past? I don't know what to do with this addiction I'm dealing with. Why did God allow me to get sick? You have a hope, you have a faith that should be able to reach into people's lives and make a difference. You see, we sometimes get so caught up trying to answer questions that people aren't asking. You have a hope for some of the greatest problems that we face. And if we're going to be able to answer, we must first be able to listen. And I'm not good at it. If we're going to stay on point, where we can have an answer to the questions that are being asked, Paul reminds us we've got to be wise. We've got to allow our conversations to be gracious. And he stops and he says, you need to come up with answers or solutions to the problems that we face. How do we do this? One, we need to change our attitude towards others. We need to value others as God does. Number two, stop and we need to listen to the questions that are being asked. One more thing, if we're going to stop and be wise, if we're going to stop and allow our conversations to be gracious, if we're going to stop and find solutions to the problems that are out there with our faith, how does our faith intersect with real life? I think there's one more thing we need to learn to do. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 2, and by the way, here's a little spoiler alert. If you're here Tuesday night, we're going to try to get into this a little bit more, this whole idea. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 2, Solomon makes a statement that I think is just ground-shatteringly brilliant. And yet you knew it. Fools have no interest in understanding. They only want to air their own opinion. You see, Solomon, as he looks at us and as we're trying to find the answers, as we're trying to allow the hope that we have to be part of the solution, Solomon looks at us and says, yes, you value others. Yes, number two, you need to listen. But number three, Solomon says, try to understand. Sometimes we can hear a question and we simply go, I don't understand you. How did you come up with that conclusion? I don't know how you can think that. And by the way, if you've ever asked that question, I got to be the first to put my hand up. Whenever we make a statement that says, I don't understand how you can, you know what that says? That says more about me than that person. What does it say? I don't understand. We are called as followers of Jesus Christ, if we're going to have an answer, that we seek to value, to hear, and to understand. By the way, sometimes if you actually could really understand a person's conclusion, you would go, I get it. I get how you got there. Doesn't make it right and it doesn't bring hope, but I get it. Understanding. God calls us, if we're to have an answer. And by the way, you have the answer. It is found in Jesus Christ. It is found in forgiveness that he's given. But we need to learn, if we're going to answer, we need to value, we need to hear, and we at least need to seek to understand. I'm not saying you seek to agree with everything. I'm simply saying that you seek to understand. Okay. I know I'm supposed to tell you this morning that Jesus is the greatest answer. And by the way, I believe it with all my heart. As your pastor, I have become more convinced of this over the years. The more people that I deal with, the more people I talk to, the more problems that we face and that we see coming up, the only answer that I see can be found in the forgiveness and the hope that we find in Jesus Christ. Life is much more complicated today than it was in 1990 when I came into Pensacola. The questions that are being asked today, some of them I never thought we would even ask. The issues that we are facing today, and by the way, they're not simple. There is nothing that we can do. We can't simply say, well, Jesus said no. I mean, that's an answer, and that's good enough for us, isn't it? But if we're going to have an answer, we need to stop and value other people. We need to get beyond that idea of going, man, you have no common sense. I don't get how you got there. How could you do that? We need to truly value others. We need to stop and hear what they have to say. What is the questions they're asking? 3, do we seek to understand? You see, I think if we do that, we can stop and we say, yes, how does Christ intersecting? I can't answer your question necessarily, but I can tell you what I have found true in my life. You see, here's one of the common, no matter where you come from, no matter what you do, one of the things we all have in common is that all of us have been in need of a Savior. I don't care what your problem is, and you haven't been in and go, hey, Pastor, I know what all your problems are, but I know this. There is a commonality between both of us. We have all been in need of someone to reach into our lives and to forgive us and to pull us up. I know this morning you're a great person. But we've all been in need of forgiveness. We have that in common. You know what else I know we have in common? If you're a parent, you want the best for your kids. If you are an adult, you want a future. We have a hope. God's done so much for us. How do we begin to take that hope? And we may not, and I'm not saying we're going to be able to answer some of the questions that are asked us, but what I am saying is we can listen and we can value and we can at least try to understand. Life is complicated. And I know I want to get it right. And I know you want to get it right. And I believe our answer is found in Jesus Christ. Let's be willing to try to come up with answers wisely, with speech that is gracious, knowing how our hope is found in the one who gave his life for us. Father,